Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on the Cowboy Story, we ride the stories of the West Campfire truths, trail dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. San Juan wind sawed along the ridge and bit through wool. Nora Whitfield rode with her chin tucked to the collar of Sam's old hat, breath pluming fingers stiff inside damp mittens. Brandy the sorrel mare shouldered drifts that came to the cinch. The world was iron and ash-black trunks and white glare as if a charcoal pencil had sketched it and left no color to spare. An oilskin packet pressed under Nora's coat with each rise of the saddle. She knew what lay inside by touch. Claim paper from Durango. Receipts. A handbill crisp and smug from Victor Pike. He had slid it across his desk with 2 fingers while the coal stove in his office roasted the room and made the smell of his hair tonic sweet and stale. Climate does cruel things to a woman alone, Pike had said, eyes never quite landing on hers. Sell now. I am being generous. Nora had answered with a tight smile. Back in the street at Prospect Crossing, the wind had yanked her shawl and laughter had spooled out from the copper lantern. Cards slapped a piano, limped through a popular tune, and someone called her name with a voice that wanted to be kind and failed. She had kept walking. Up here, the only voice was the wind. The timberline swallowed the town. Then the trail took its last breath and turned into a guess. Pines had shouldered their branches under snow. Creeks were sealed with milk-glass ice that snapped when a hoof tested it and refused. Shadows moved with the sun and made the ridgeline seem closer than it was. By the time the cabin showed a dark underline against a slope, Nora's thighs burned and her lips were numb. The porch was a white hump. The north wall was packed solid past the windowsill. One shutter hung crooked and slapped wood with a tired, maddening rhythm. Brandy blew and tossed her head. "We made it," Nora said, and her voice came out a dry scrape. She tied the mare to a bent pine where the wind scrolled less, then waded to the door and put her shoulder into it. The plank had swelled and the drift had turned to concrete on the other side. Her boots slipped. She swore under her breath, set her hip shoved again. The door groaned a complaint and gave a stingy handspan. Cold air surged over stale dust and mouse smell. Inside was dark and louder with the wind than outside had been. The cabin held the noise and shook with it. She set the oilskin on the table. The table wobbled. Sam had made it in a hurry last spring. She found the tin of lucifer matches in the carved notch where she had always kept it, struck one, cupped it. Blue, then yellow. A small, weak sun. Kindling took if she breathed just right. The first thin flame licked up bark and wanted to die. Nora fed it slivers, then sticks, then a log Sam had split and stacked so carefully the edges still showed his axe marks. Heat came like a promise that might be broken. Smoke moved up the throat of the chimney, straight and strong. Her hands stopped hurting because they had gone past it. The room came into itself as the fire found its feet, caught against the wall. Peg with Sam's pocket watch looped through a leather thong glass spidered. A whittling knife left in a cup. The window with frost like ferns etched on the inside. A ring on her finger that had always fit a little tight when it was cold. The shutter thudded and scraped. Nora flinched, then breathed, then found the iron poker. She set a pot of snow near the coals and listened for Brandy. The mare's bit jangled faintly when the gusts dropped. Her coat steamed in a curl where the fire licked the air. She pulled the oilskin open. Paper at her fingertips, the tooth of it familiar. The handbill in Pike's perfect type sat on top. She had kept it for a reason she did not want to name. The claim receipt had ink blotted from where she had signed with cold hands. She slid the packet back and tied the thong twice for good measure. The cabin felt too small for all she had carried up the mountain. The wind shifted. The door shivered in its frame. She set the bar in the brackets and tested it. The iron squeaked. The shutter banged again, and this time the hinge gave a wooden complaint that made the hair at her nape lift. Nora knelt by the fire and fed it a stick. She thought of the copper lantern and Sam's back hunched over a hand he should not have played. She thought of the faces of Prospect Crossing, turn-away faces, pity faces, dog-hungry faces. She added another stick and watched it catch. When the knock came, it did not sound like wood. It sounded like a body heavy on the planks. Nora froze with the poker in her hand. The second blow rattled the board across the latch. A man's breath came through the seam, harsh and white. "Shelter," the voice said, "for the love of God." Nora stood mouth dry. She edged to the door and leaned her forehead to the cold. "Who are you?" "Caleb Mercer," the voice said after a pause long enough to be measured. "Mules in your lean-to. Lost the trail. I am freezing, ma'am." Wind tried to make his words into something else. She could not see him through the crack near the hinge. In the high country, you did not let a man freeze. In the high country, a man could be anything he said he was. Nora lifted the bar. The door came in with the weight of him. A shape of canvas and ice staggered over the threshold and caught himself on the jamb with one blue hand. He stayed on his knees. Snow sloughed off his shoulders and puddled on the floorboards. He had a beard white with frost. His eyes were winter river gray and tired to the bone. "Close it," Nora said, "then step back." "Yes, ma'am." He pushed the door with his shoulder and dropped the bar. He stayed where he was, breath ragged, then scooted on his heels to the spot near the door, as if she had drawn a chalk line. He smelled like pine sweat gone cold old leather. "Hands where I can see them," Nora said. He took his mittens off slow so she could see the motion and set them open on the floor. "Thank you," he said. He looked at the fire the way a man looks at a well. "You sleep by the door," she said. "You do not move from that plank." "Yes, ma'am." He did not ask for coffee. He did not reach toward heat. He sat with his back to the logs and flexed his fingers, once a wince crossing his face like a shadow. The shutter scraped and thudded again. The sound gnawed at the room. Nora went to the peg, took down a cup, and filled it with hot water. She poured a little black from the tail of her tin. She held the cup out like a piece she could take back. He wrapped both hands around it and let the heat do what it could. He did not drink right away. He watched the fire until the steam thinned from his beard. When he drank, he did it like a man who had learned to be careful of his blessings. "Storm came quick," Nora said, and the words were a test. "Faster than it looked from town," he said. "Prospect Crossing sits in a lie. The mountains are honest." The wind agreed, shaking the cabin so that the dishes on the shelf clicked. Nora sat on the cot and kept the poker at her side. Brandy stomped once outside, a dull thud through drift and wood. The fire found a rhythm. Smoke rolled up clean. Heat tapped her cheeks and made the tip of her nose burn. Nora rubbed her thumb over the rim of the cup. She had kept the one with a chip the size of a fingernail. "Thank you," he said again without looking at her. "Do not thank me yet," she said. He nodded. He did not smile. He pulled his coat tighter with stiff hands and set the empty cup on the floor by his boot heel to toe with the board edge, like a man used to keeping his things small. The shutter banged. Outside, a coyote sang something thin that the wind cut to ribbons. Inside, the hearth drew and then faltered. The fire coughed a breath of black, just enough to sting the eyes. Somewhere inside the wall, a hinge made a slow, tired sound. Nora watched the smoke lift again, thin and straight. She did not lower the poker. The shutter hit the siding again. The hinge moaned a tired note. Smoke lifted straight for a beat, then smeared, then drew true. Nora watched the draft settle and stood. "You have a hammer," the man by the door said. His voice came low, careful not to carry like a hand laid flat. "In the box under the cot." Nora kept the poker in her hand and tipped her chin. He moved only when she moved. He crossed to the cot with small steps, opened the crate, and held tools up so she could see he had nothing else. "Hammer nails in a cloth twist a length of bent wire. That hinge will tear free," he said. "It is letting the snow into the seam." She nodded. "Fix it." He pried the window open with the claw, broke the crust that had sealed it, and the storm rushed in with a shriek. The fire flattened and spat. Cold powder spun across the room and stung her cheeks. Half of him vanished into the white. His boots slid on the floorboards. Nora lunged and planted a hand against his back to brace him without thinking. His coat was ice. Her palm burned. He found the shutter, caught it, and drove a nail. Once, twice, 3 times. The blows were dull in the roar. He pulled himself in and shouldered the window down. The latch bit. Silence arrived in a rough way, full of breath and steam. "You are freezing," Nora said. "It is done." He wiped his beard with the heel of his hand. Ice cracked and fell to the floor. They listened to the changed sound. No more slap, only wind and the low rumble it left in the logs. The fire started to climb again, a deepening orange that felt like a held hand. "Sit," Nora said. "There." She pointed to the plank he had chosen by the door. The rule needed saying so it would hold. "Yes, ma'am." She fetched the pot of snow and set it where the heat would do its work without boiling away a blessing. He watched the water become itself, his face turning alive, inch by inch. When he tried to pull his boots, his mouth tightened. The leather had frozen in its own shape. "Leave them," she said. "You will not get them back on." He left them. He rubbed his hands together, once winced and stilled. "Your name," Nora said. "Caleb Mercer." A pause. "Prospect Crossing knows me as a man who brings in mules." Nora looked at his eyes, gray that held to the fire. No darting, no slide. He was choosing stillness like a man who knew how to live around fear. Morning arrived as a heavy white press against the window. Light without color. Nora woke with smoke in her throat and a part of her that had learned to hear the draft. The fire had slumped to a bed of coals. Caleb sat in the same place he had claimed and had not slept. His eyes were clear with that particular kind of tired that does not beg. "Good morning," she said. "Ma'am," he studied the window. "Snow is above the sill." She went to the door and lifted the bar. The plank groaned. The door opened 6 inches, then stopped. Not porch, not air. Only a clean cut of white against the opening. Fine crystals blew in like dust and stung the skin of her face. She leaned and tried to shoulder it. The drift pushed back with a weight that did not care. "We are inside," Caleb said, "for a time." Nora set the bar down with more force than she needed to. Food. The mouse box had held up. She opened it and took inventory with fingers that measured and minds that do arithmetic without wanting to. Pinto beans. A slab of salt pork hard as a sentence. A heel of flour still dry under the tied bag. Coffee enough for a few blind mornings. She set the beans on the shelf and breathed through the numbers. "Half cup each," she said. "Pork shaved, coffee only once." "That is a good plan," Caleb said. He said it as if he had no right to make plans here. "See to the fire," she said, and passed the poker to him. The gesture made a line. He could break the wood and not the rules. He banked the coals with the quiet of a man who had lived with small flames. He did not feed it wild. He built a fire that would last on less. When he rose, the shutter rattled once in protest, and then sat still convinced by his work. They ate at the table Sam had made. Nora flicked a chip of wood from the wobble and set the bowls. Beans that gave more warmth than taste. Coffee that carried a ghost of itself. They did not speak because speaking felt like taking light from the room. When the bowls were empty, Caleb set his spoon in his bowl at a straight line with the table edge. "That shutter will hold," he said. "The path will not," she said. He nodded. "We dig." The door took both of them to open. They leaned and pushed, and the drift yielded an inch, then another. The first breath of air that was not stale hit them like river water. They taught the drift to be a trench with a shovel that had known winter before. Caleb went first and made the snow part with his shoulders, his whole body an instrument. He spoke only once to give one instruction. "Stay behind me." She did until she slipped. The path was narrow. Ice hid under the powder like a grin. Her boot went, her balance went, her whole self slid sideways into a cold pocket. Snow swallowed her to the collar. It tasted clean and old. She tried to kick and could not. For a moment she was a girl in a feather bed, and she laughed. The laugh of somebody tripped by a small thing that could have been a big thing. Caleb turned. He stood over her with a look that had a smile pressed into the corners. He did not laugh. He set the shovel in the bank and held down one hand. "Bare, raw. Take it." Nora took it. His grip closed warm in the cold, and the world levered. She came up with a sound that puffed powder and landed against him for the length of a heartbeat. His chest was heat under wool. He smelled of smoke and sap. She stepped back so fast her heel jammed into the trench wall. "Thank you," she said. "Best keep your feet in the middle," he said. His voice was level, no pride in it. He picked up the shovel and carved 3 more feet of passage like he was writing the letter of their survival. They reached the lean-to. The roof sagged with weight. The mule's breath steamed, one braid short and frightened. Caleb spoke to them in a tone that belonged to another version of him. He fed them from a bag he had strapped to his rig and rubbed a nose with the heel of his bandaged hand until the animal blinked slow. By the time they had a path, their arms had become something beyond their control. Fingers refused to close. Cheeks burned and then went numb. Inside again, the cabin felt small and earned. Nora put a pot over the fire. Caleb sat on the floor and worked at his boots with a patience that looked like prayer. When he finally got one free, he hissed not from pain, but from the sensation returning. She saw his hands then. The skin at the knuckles split to faint red smiles. The fingers swollen and mapped with small white cracks. "Snow water," she said. She melted a tin cup full cooled it, set it near him. She brought down a twist of linen and a small tin of salve the color of river clay. "Give me your left." "They will be fine," he said. "Give me your left." He obeyed. His hand was heavy in hers and very still. She cleaned the cuts with water and dabbed them dry with the edge of her sleeve. He watched her face, not her hands. She felt the watching and kept her eyes on the work. She smoothed salve across the damage and the skin drank it. She wrapped the linen over the palm and around the thumb, then crossed it neat over the knuckles. Her fingers brushed his wrist. His breath changed, and she felt the change like a small heat on the air. She did the right hand. When she was done, she kept both of his hands between hers for a beat longer than she needed to, and then set them gently in his lap. "That should help," she said. He looked at the fire. "It already does." The shutter stayed quiet. The cabin settled into a rhythm the way a body does when it is finally warm. The beans for evening had to be stretched all the same. Nora measured. Caleb sliced the pork to shadows and laid the pieces on the lip of the stove to sweat their salt into the pot. The smell turned the room softer. She found a fist of wild onion she had dried and forgot and crumbled it in. It smelled like green remembered in a hard winter. They ate, and something eased in the space between them. Not friendship, not truce. Work. He told her a piece of a trail from the year before, a night near Raton Pass, when lightning had stepped across the ridge like a giant and turned his herd stupid with fear. He said the word stupid as if he was forgiving the world for not knowing better. She told him a small piece about Prospect Crossing and how the women did not look, and the men looked too much. She did not say Sam's name. She did not say Copper Lantern. Her thumb rolled her ring without her permission. Caleb watched the motion and not the ring. "Words bruise," he said. "Bruises go deep when there is no meat on your bones." She almost smiled at his odd way of putting a thing. She poured him another inch of stew, even though it meant her bowl ran thin. Night moved down the window. The wind traded its shriek for a high hiss along the eaves. The fire breathed steady. Nora lay on the cot with her boots still on and the poker on the floor where her hand could find it without looking. She faced the wall because the wall was a simple thing. Sleep came like a stumble on a step. It threw her into the Copper Lantern and the smell of cheap whiskey and a card slapped too hard. She woke on a small cry and sat up with her heart running. Caleb was a shape by the door. He stood without haste, crossed to the hearth, and picked up the spare blanket she had packed at the bottom of her roll. He walked toward her, slow, each step measured as if not to wake an animal that could bite. He did not touch her. He laid the folded blanket over her feet, then the length of her to her waist. The weight made her feel held, and the feeling startled her almost as much as the nightmare. He looked down at her without anything on his face that would make her run. He turned and went back to his plank. Nora held the edge of the blanket in both hands and listened to his breathing. It came slow and sure. The ring dug a line into her finger. She turned it and then held still. Morning again. The light at the window had gone from white to a gray that promised more weather. Coffee thin enough to show the bottom of the cup sat warm in her palm. The shutter gave a test rattle and stopped. "That hinge will hold," Caleb said. His voice was rough with sleep, lost but steady. He rose and looked at the chimney, then at the black smear left on a stone where smoke had failed for a breath the night before. "The throat needs scraping." Later Nora said, "Eat." They were not down to nothing, but the arithmetic looked mean. Caleb set his bowl carefully on the table and met the thought without words. He lifted his wrapped hands and flexed them. The linen puckered. He seemed surprised that fingers could feel like part of a body again. She stood. The rifle hung on pegs above the hearth. She had not touched it since a day with Sam, when he had laughed at the recoil and called her Liz as if the syllable belonged to him. The metal looked colder than anything in the room. Caleb saw where her eyes had gone. "Do not," he said. "There is game in the trees." She did not take her eyes off the rifle. "You do not track in weather like this. You will lose the cabin in 50 steps. I will keep my hand on the wall until the corner. I have eyes. I have legs." She reached up and took the rifle down. It was heavier than she wanted. The wood was slick with oil that smelled of almonds. "You do not know if it is clean. You do not know if it will shoot straight. It is the only meat left that is not on a mule." She turned and shrugged into her coat. It had not dried all the way. The fabric kissed her neck with cold. "At least let me sit by the door," he said. "I can watch the trees. I might get a shot." "You said it," she said. "You cannot stand in a drift and keep your feet." He looked at the floor and then at her face. He wanted to argue. He did not. "Be fast," he said. She lifted the bar. The door ripped out of her hands and slammed against the outside wall. The trench they had carved was already a memory. Snow had kept working while they slept. The white rose and fell in sheets that made the trees bend. Nora held the rifle close and kept her shoulder against the cabin. She moved the way you move when you keep a hand on a thing that can save you. At the corner, she turned and counted her steps into the trees. 30 felt like a mile. The pines broke the wind. The quiet behind them felt like a held breath. She leaned against a trunk and let her lungs catch. Her shoulder hurt just from holding the weight. She hated that it hurt. She listened and heard the small sounds that live even when the big ones try to kill them. A twig under snow, a tiny tear of bark. She turned and saw a motion that was not wind. A hare with feet like paddle's coat gone white with the season nibbling at something buried. It sat up ears like question marks. Nora rested the barrel on a low branch and lined the sight. Her hands shook. Not from cold. She told the shake it could have the next minute, not this one. She squeezed. The sound cracked the air and punched her shoulder. Smoke bloomed and blew flat. She lost the sight picture. There was a mark on the snow where red met white and did not ask permission. She went to it. The hair lay in a fold of wind-carved drift, heavy and warm through her gloves. Something inside her that had been shrinking opened a notch. She laughed once, and the wind took it. She turned and found the cabin by color and by the line of trench that had begun to fill again. Her legs were not tired. They were only attached to her and going. She fell through the doorway with the rifle in one hand and the hair in the other. Caleb had been standing by the bar as if he had grown there. He took in the animal and the color in her face and the cut on her cheek she had not felt. "You are bleeding," he said. "It is a scratch," she said. She put the hair on the table. Blood spotted the wood, and she did not care. "This is stew." Caleb looked at her in a way that made her want to put both feet wider on the floor. Not hunger. Respect that felt like heat. "Well," he said, "all right then." He skinned fast with the knife from the cup and set the meat to brown where the pork fat had left a memory. He worked quiet, only a small sound from his throat when he set the bones aside for boiling. Nora found the last of the onions and crumbled them. The smell that rose from the pot was victory small and real. They ate with their backs warmed by the hearth. The wind wrote its own story on the walls. Nora felt the stew sit heavy and good. Caleb leaned back and looked into the fire the way a man looks at a road he knows. He tamped tobacco into a pipe and did not light it. Saving things had become the measure. "You are a good shot," he said. "I was lucky," she said, "and desperate." "That counts." He set the pipe aside. Nora touched the ring and then took her hand off it. "Sam liked cards more than sense," she said. "The name tasted like metal. They say things in town." "Town fills its mouth so it does not have to feel its stomach," he said. She huffed something like a laugh. The room felt different. It felt a degree warmer in a place that had nothing to do with fire. Nora banked the coals and set the pot to the side so it would give them breakfast that was more than hot water. The room breathed. The shutter stayed quiet. She rolled her blanket out on the floor by the hearth. He rolled his by the door. They lay on their sides with a space between that felt like a promise kept. Nora looked at the ceiling until the lines in the wood stopped making shapes. She turned once and saw his face in the flicker. He was awake and not moving, and the stillness looked like a kind of work. She reached across the space with her hand and set it palm down on his. He did not pull away. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. He did not move her closer. He waited. She slid toward him the length of a blanket. He turned his face to her. The kiss that came was a simple thing that became not simple and then stopped when she stopped. He let it go. His chest rose and fell like a man who had been running and knew how to stop. He rolled to his back and stared at the ceiling. She lay on her side and listened to the wind change to something lower. The fire settled. The room cooled. They slept. By afternoon of the next day, the wind had another voice. It had teeth again, and the kind of speed that means trouble under it. The shutter held. The chimney drew. The path outside would not. A sound cut the room clean. Not the wind, not the shutter, a knock that carried in bone. A voice followed, shaped right by law. "Mrs. Whitfield." The man outside spoke plain. "Deputy Eli Harrelson, I see your smoke." Nora kept her hand on the latch. Smoke moved clean again. Her name hung in the wood. "Mrs. Whitfield," the voice said. "Deputy Eli Harrelson, I see your smoke." She looked at the man by the door. His eyes had gone to slate. He stood without sound and came 3 steps not closer. "Cellar," he said. The word was a breath. She kicked the bare hide and found the iron ring with her fingers. The trap was stubborn. She lifted hard and cold earth, side up damp and old on her face. Potatoes and dirt. Caleb looked at the hole, then at her. He took 1 step down and then paused. The place between them was no more than 2 hands. "My name," he said low and clean. "Not Caleb, Jonah Hale, Texas." A foreman put his hands on a girl. He reached for a gun. I reached faster. His brother wears a senator's coat and wants me dead. $500 any man's law. Everything in the room pointed at his voice. Nora felt the cold in her mouth. "Go," she said. He climbed down. The hole swallowed him to his shoulders. "Do not let him in," he said. "Talk through the door. Tell him you are alone." She shut it. The weight of the trap was a story in her arms. She pulled the hide over the seams and smoothed it flat with her palms. The bar on the door shook with the next knock. "Nora," Deputy Harrelson said. It was the first time he had used her given name to her face. Open up. Quick look. Storm had folks worried. She put her cheek to the plank. The wood was cold and smelled of smoke and old resin. Door is drifted tight, she said. I am not decent. Decent can wait, ma'am. The butt of his glove found the board across the latch. The sound crawled into the room. Mule Train never made it in. A man who calls himself Mercer did not come to the stable. You had company up here? I did not. She kept her breath steady and shallow. Only the mare. Silence then, the jingle of tack, a small squeak from a saddle leather. He moved his horse a step. Funny thing, he said. Telegraph from down Texas way says a man named Jacob Holt drifted north. Tall, dark beard, scar by a rib, works cattle, runs mule when he has to, pays his bills in quiet and leaves quick. That name mean anything. Nora looked at the bear hide without looking. No. Harrelson breathed. It sounded like a thought he did not want. All right, snow is up to my cinch. A body can lie and get away with it in weather like this. He paused. Thaw is coming. I will ride back when a horse can find footing. We can be neighborly then. She did not answer. He sat there another breath. She heard the horse turn. The sound of big hooves in soft white moved off the porch, then down the cut of the hill. Leather creaked once and wind took the rest. Nora slid to the floor and sat on the bear hide. The boards beneath her were a drum. Her hands did not know where to be. She found the ring on her finger and pressed it to the skin until it left a mark. When she could stand, she did. She pulled the trap, and cold air came up again. Jonah climbed the ladder slow and careful, the way he had crossed the storm, to fix her shutter. Dirt streaked his coat. His face had gone pale under the beard. He stepped into the light, and she stepped back as if he had teeth. You, she said. It came out smaller than she wanted. I told you, he said. He would not have listened. You told me after. Her chest hurt. You put your life in my hands and did not let me know what those hands were holding. His own hands opened and closed once. The linen she had wrapped had turned darker where the dirt found it. He set them at his sides. You were with the man who fixed your fire. You were with the man who kept his distance. The paper name is what men chase with guns. The man standing here is the one who sat by your door. The argument ran into a wall inside her and had no place to go. Outside, something new spoke, a drip on the eave. The sound repeated sure and steady. Another from the far corner, then three more faster. The roof ticked. The world leaned toward water. Nora crossed to the table and set the oilskin down. She untied the thong. Her fingers did not shake. She found Victor Pike's handbill and placed it to the side. She took the blank with the good tooth. She dipped a pen and wrote, Victor Pike, I decline your offer. The claim stands and is not for sale. My circumstances have changed. I have married. My husband is a steady man and a fine shot. We will be staying on the land. Do not call again. She read it once, not out loud. She signed clean. Mrs. Nora Whitfield. The words filled the space in her chest that had felt hollow since the storm took the shape of a man. Jonah watched from by the door with his pack on his shoulder. The knot had been tied long before the ink dried. The sight of it made something narrow in her vision. You are leaving, she said. I will not bring a rope to your porch, he said. Harrelson will come. So will the senator's running dogs. If I am gone, they take their dust and go back the way they came. You build your life with both hands and no one pulls at your sleeves. She folded the letter and slid it into the oilskin. You are running. I am making it so you can stop. He reached for the latch. Sun had found a gap at the edge of the cloud, and the light that came in carried the smell of wet pine and raw mud. She stood long enough to feel what standing would do to her. Then she moved. The lean-to held a low ceiling and an old fear of rot. He was by the mule with his hands on the cinch. She took his coat in both hands and yanked him against the beam so the wood thumped. His breath hitched. She kissed him with teeth and heat and all the words she did not know how to say. He set his hands on her waist to push her away, and then stopped pushing and pulled instead with a sound that chose. They went back inside. The rain came soft. It felt like the world had a new skin. He built the fire higher with care, and they did not talk. She unrolled her blanket on the rug in front of the hearth. He unrolled his beside it close enough that a hand could find a hand without a search. They lay on their sides and looked into the oranges and blues that live in hardwood when it burns right. Nora, he said. She turned, and he was there. His face was quiet. He put his hand up between them and held it open. The bandage cut the lines of his palm in white. She set her hand on his. He turned his and laced his fingers through hers. He pulled her in with slow strength. The kiss was not a question this time. It was an answer that kept coming. His hand found the back of her neck, and her body went warm in places that had been winter. They found each other without talk. He traced the scar low on his rib where the bullet had left a crooked star. She followed the mark with her mouth as if a map could bring a man home. He said her name like prayer and not like claim. They took their time and took it again until there was only breathing and some kind of quiet on the far side of it. Rain touched the roof and kept time. Fire settled to a deep bed of coals and glowed like fruit. She put her head on his shoulder and listened to his heart. He pulled the blanket to her neck and held it there as if the weight could keep the room from sliding. When she woke, he was still asleep. Morning came in a pale wash through the window. The drip had become a soft run off the eaves. Patches of dark ground showed at the edge of the trench and brown water moved like snakes on the slope. The air in the cabin felt washed. She sat up and held her left hand in front of her face. The ring had cut a white circle in her skin. She slid it off and felt the relief like a cool drink. She stood and went to the hearth. She pressed at the loose stone in the corner and felt the grit shift. She crouched and lifted it. The space beneath was dry and black. She held the ring a long second. Sam's laugh flickered against a card table in her mind, and then it went. She put the ring into the dirt with 2 fingers and pushed it flat. The stone went back and sat true. The sound of it landing was small and complete. Outside in the yard, a jay called once. Far below, hoofs found mud and made it speak. The echo climbed the slope and reached the porch in a tired rhythm that did not belong to a coyote or to wind. Nora stood. The fire held. The room waited. Hoofs hit the mud in a heavy 3-beat. The porch boards hummed. Nora stepped to the doorway. Caleb stood already in the yard with the axe loose in his hand. His shirt was dark at the collar from work. Steam rose from the heads of the mules under the lean-to. The air held that wet iron smell that comes when snow gives up. Deputy Eli Harrelson rode first. His star caught a square of sun and flashed quick. The man beside him wore a city suit the color of a storm cloud, now spattered to the knee. He had a narrow face and eyes that never rested. The horse under him did not like him. "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield," Harrelson said. His tone was polite and tired. He saw the roof patch the trench widened. The garden strip turned. He did not look long at any of it. "You seem to have found help." "I did," Nora said, her voice carried without strain. The thin man smiled like a knife turned sideways. "He is more than help, deputy. Name is Rafe Dillard. Santa Fe. I keep accounts for Senator Crowley. The gentleman with the axe is Jonah Hale. We have been looking a long time." Caleb let the axe fall into the mud so it stood up like a stake. He lifted his hands open. "I am Caleb Mercer," he said, "and I am also that name. I am here." Harrelson slid off his horse with a small grunt. He took the rope from his saddle horn, and the movement was practiced. "Jonah Hale. You are under arrest for the murder of a foreman in Texas." "No," Nora said. Harrelson stopped with one boot still in the stirrup. The word cut the space clean. Nora stepped into the yard and stood in front of his horse. The animal pushed hot breath that smelled of hay. She did not flinch. "Ma'am," Harrelson said, "do not do this. Law is the law." Nora set the oilskin packet on her palm and held it out. The thong was muddy. "Then do it right," she said. "Read." He did not take it. His eyes went to Dillard and back. Nora kept her hand up until the muscles in her shoulder burned. Harrelson reached and took the packet with a small sigh, like a man taking a spade for work he did not want. She spoke plain. Sister Marisol Reyes, convent in New Mexico. Testimony sworn and sealed. She wrote what the foreman did and who stopped him with a gun when she ran. She names the foreman. She names Jonah Hale. She tapped the packet. A letter from One-Eyed Tom, a trail hand, his mark and a witness mark. He saw the draw and the first shot. He says Jonah took the second. Dillard laughed once and the sound sat wrong in the yard. Paper tricks, not worth the ink. Nora pointed to the third folded page. Letter to the territorial governor in Denver for a pardon. Post stamped and logged at the office in Durango. "Deputy, you know the clerk there." "I do," Harrelson said. He thumbed the seal with a gloved finger. His eyes did not move for a long count. He slid the papers into his own coat instead of back to her. He looked at Caleb the way a man looks at a bridge that might hold. "You plan to run." "I planned to until she put herself in the road," Caleb said. "Senator will not like this," Dillard hissed. His lips went white. "This is $500 left in the mud." Harrelson allowed himself a short breath of exasperation. "This territory still answers to men under sky. We do not bring rope to a door without thinking." He put the rope back on his saddle. "You stay put," he said to Caleb. "You keep that axe for wood." He looked at Nora. "You keep trouble small. I do not want to climb this hill again." "Yes, Deputy," Nora said. Dillard spat mud out of his mouth by mistake and cursed quiet into his sleeve. He glared up at the cabin. His eyes tried to put hands on things. He found nothing that would let him grab. "The senator writes fast and writes loud," he said. "Then write to him on your own time," Harrelson said. He swung into his saddle and set his heel. "We are done here." They turned and picked their way down the grade. The horses hated the mud, and the mud hated them back. The rhythm of hoof on earth faded slow. The lean-to sighed when the wind changed. The world was left with its ordinary sounds. Water off the eaves, a jay, deep under it all the creek starting to talk again. Caleb stood like he did not know what to do with his hands. He looked at Nora with a face that held two men, and both of them were trying to breathe. He took a step and then another, then he dropped to his knees in the cold brown muck. He wrapped his arms around her waist and set his face into the apron she wore. His shoulders shook once, then went still. His breath was loud because he had kept it so long. Nora put both hands in his hair and did not say anything. The weight of him felt right. He stayed there until his knees hurt, and then he stood slow. Mud streaked his trousers. A smear of it crossed his cheek. He did not wipe it. "Come in," she said. The room had kept the heat. The hearthstone glowed low. She set the kettle and fetched a basin. He sat on the bear hide without a word. She knelt and lifted his foot and worked the laces, then slid each boot off. His socks were wet. She warmed water with her hand and poured it over his instep. It ran brown into the basin. He hissed at the new heat and then took a breath when it settled. She washed his feet as if they were something breakable, then patted them dry and pressed the towel into the arches with the flat of her palms. He watched her hands. He did not reach. "Your hands," she said. He held them out. The linen had loosened. Dirt had found a way. She unwound the strips and saw the places she had closed, now pink and clean. She cleaned what was left to clean and wrapped them again. Her fingers moved in the pattern they had made the first time, over the palm, around the thumb, across the knuckles. She tied the ends on the back so he would not catch them on anything. He flexed, and the cloth held. He reached up and touched her cheek with the back of his bandaged fingers. The touch was clumsy and careful. She closed her eyes because it felt like something had finally matched something else. Rain began. Not the sleet that cut. A soft rain that filled the yard with a sound like beads poured out of a jar. The roof took it without complaint. Where the water had once worked through the seam, the patch Caleb had laid held true. Nora went to the hearth and lifted the lid on the pot. The stew from last night had dropped to a thickness that needed only heat. She stirred and scratched the bottom so nothing would catch. The smell grew good with onion and bone. Caleb stood and took 2 bowls from the shelf and set them on the table with care. The wood of the wobble caught, and he slid a folded cloth under one leg to still it. He had learned the room the way a man learns where a horse likes to be brushed. They ate and did not speak overmuch. Words gave way to the scrape of spoon and the small noises a person makes when warmed from inside. When they had finished, he took the bowls to the basin and washed them with a tenderness that looked funny on a man his size. He dried them and set them in a line. Light came in low and colored from the west. It touched the oilskin, lying where Harrelson had left a handprint. It shone on the letter for Victor Pike that Nora had tucked back. The packet looked smaller without the fear that had lived in it. Caleb lifted the whittling knife from the cup and sat by the door where he kept his promise. He turned a strip of pine in his bandaged hands and shaved it to a smooth latch, with a peg that would seat true. The knife made a soft hush each time it bit. Nora watched from the table. The sound felt like a house giving up its tension. He bored the hole with the tip and rubbed the piece with his thumb until it shone. "Let us fit it," he said. They stood at the door and held the latch in place, and he tapped a nail with the back of the knife handle because he would not waste a hammer blow. The wood took it without splitting. He set the peg and tried it. When Nora lifted and dropped the bar, the latch kissed the jamb with a small sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She closed the door and lifted the latch from inside. It sat neat as a thought that had come to its finish. He looked at the pieces of wood left in his hand. He pocketed them. He did not throw them into the fire. Rain softened and thinned. The smell in the room changed to warm damp. Nora went to the window and wiped the inside frost with the heel of her hand. Drops ran and traced the glass. She could see the trench and the edge of dark earth where she had turned for a garden. The furrows looked like lines in a palm waiting to be read. Caleb came to stand beside her. He did not crowd her. She let her shoulder lean until it met his arm. They looked at the yard until it was only gray, and then only the reflection of their faces in the pane. The fire breathed, and the latch held, and the rain told its slow story on the roof. Snow sank day by day until the trench became a path of brown glass. The creek found its voice again and talked under the alder roots. The cabin let go of cold in the slow way a body does. When the earth took a thumbprint and kept it, Nora brought out the sack of potatoes Caleb had dragged from the lean-to. Most were mush and smell, a few had eyes. They worked the south strip where the sun came first. The spade slid and lifted, and the soil broke into clods that steamed in the chill. Nora cut the potatoes with a small knife each piece with one bright eye and handed them to him. He pointed with 2 fingers to show depth. A handspan, space between. He did not say much. He set a plant and pressed the earth snug with his palm. She followed him down the row until the furrow took shape and held a straight line like a breath held true. Sparrows hopped in the turned dirt and pecked at whatever the shovel had brought up. A jay scolded from the pine. The smell of wet soil clung to everything. Nora had dirt in the half-moons of her nails and did not try to clean it out. When they finished the last row, they stood with their hands on their hips and looked at what looked like nothing. Caleb pushed his boot heel to firm a corner. Nora took the tin spoon wind chimes she had made from odds and hung it from the porch eave where the cartridge clacker had once rung. Wind touched it, and a little bright sound moved across the yard, thin and true. The roof needed love the sun could give. Caleb went up with a hammer and a pocket of shingles when the day turned hot enough. He moved slow on the slope. He knelt and measured with his fingers and set nails with the patience he had found in storms. Nora stood below and passed up strips. His shadow crossed her face when he reached, and the smell of heated pine tar filled the air. At noon he climbed down and they ate bread that did not rise and saved the rest of the salt pork for stew. He looked up once and watched the curl of smoke that rose clean and blue and thin. The latch he had carved found its voice. Nora liked the small click when it seated. She would touch it when she passed the door, not to test it, just to feel what fit felt like. She hunted twice when the sky held. A grouse came to the pot and a rabbit dried above the hearth on a string. She cleaned the rifle and oiled it until the metal took a dull shine. Caleb sat by the door and looked over his hands where the skin had gone new and pink. He flexed and watched linen give way to healed lines. One evening the light went long and gold. Caleb carried 2 chairs he had planed from scrap boards onto the widened porch. The legs were not perfect. They sat steady anyway. He set them side by side and then stepped back to see if they lived right in the space. Nora came out with a cup and sat. The cup left a pale ring on the rail. He took the whittling knife and a sliver of pine and made a bird because his hands needed to make something small after a season of big hurts. The bird took shape in shaving after shaving. A beak, a tail, a suggestion of wings folded close. He rubbed it smooth and set it on the rail where it could look at the yard. A rider from town came by with a sack of post for a mine farther in. Nora wrapped the pike letter in paper and tied it with string and handed it over without comment. The rider tucked it and touched his hat. Hoofbeats slid down the trail and were gone. The house looked the same after and somehow different. They laid boards to fill the soft places in the porch. The second chair scraped wood when he dragged it closer until the legs kissed. He put his arm around her waist and she leaned into him. The smell of sap and smoke lived in his shirt. Her cheek found his shoulder the way a head finds a pillow it knows. Inside Sam's pocket, watch still hung on the peg by a thong. The cracked glass threw light crooked. It had not ticked for months. It did not need to. Time ran in other ways now. Beans simmered in a low quiet. The ring under the hearth belonged to the dark and stayed there. On a clear day, the mountain looked cut from blue porcelain. Patches of snow still gripped the high gullies like old glue. The garden pushed green. Potato leaves spread in a low sea. Nora knelt and pinched off a worm. Her hands were quick. She looked at the little damage done and set the leaf back, and it did not show the wound. Caleb tested the chimney again and scraped a little soot that wanted to stay. The brush rasped stone. He came down covered in gray, and her laugh came before she could stop it. He wiped at his cheek and only made a darker handprint. She kissed that spot and tasted ash and found it sweet because it belonged to a thing that kept them warm. They spoke of small things. A creek bend that held trout. A board that needed a second nail. A hen they would trade for in time when the past saw more feet. They did not lay a map on the table. The table held bowls and wood shavings and papers that had changed what a man could be called. Evening laid color on the valley. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a thin ribbon and drew a clean line into the sky. The chimes gave 3 small notes. A cow lowed far off and did not ask for anything. The cabin held itself the way a body does when it has stopped bracing. Nora set her palm on the latch and pressed it into the socket. The sound it made was quiet and final. She looked at the garden, at the strip of turned earth with green laid over it. Caleb's hand found hers and closed around it. He did not hold hard. He held right. They sat in the chairs on the porch that faced the strip of land they had chosen. The sun slid behind the ridge. The air went cool and smelled of water and wood smoke. She tipped her head to his shoulder and watched the last light catch the knife marks on the rail. The wind touched the spoons and made a small song. The smoke climbed, the latch held, the creek talked on. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.